Good evening, everyone, and I'm very grateful to the KS Programme Committee for this opportunity to tell you about an extraordinary woman, Charlotte Elizabeth Tonna, who was in Kilkenny for just 5 years between 1819 and 1824. She didn't leave an obvious mark on the city, though this place changed her, but her memoir tells us much about the life and times of the period. Much appreciation also to Angela Moylan for her suggestion for the talk, and thanks in particular to our now deceased member Maureen Hegarty, who despite a few date errors effectively linked Charlotte Tonna with Kilkenny in her book about the Presentation Convent called Isabella and Catherine. Thanks to Mary Flood and Seamus Brennan for their assistance with finding a certain Phelan family, and to Fonzie Mealy for his knowledge and generosity with Charlotte's books. And finally, thanks to Anne Lannon for the setup and all the work she put into getting this Okay, if you were to meet Charlotte Tonna on High Street in 1820, think of a Jane Austen figure, maybe a bit more austere, tall, about 30 years of age. Her name was Mrs. Captain Phelan, but she was married to George Phelan of Kilkenny, a career soldier and officer in the British Army. He fought alongside Charlotte's brother in Portugal in the Peninsular Wars. So we're going back a whole 100 years before Angela. Charlotte Elizabeth Brown was born at Norwich in England in 1790. Her father, Michael Brown, was a Church of England rector attached to the cathedral there. As a child, she loved to read the Bible, fairy stories, even Shakespeare. Possibly because of the reading, she temporarily lost her sight at the age of 6. She was treated with mercury. Her sight recovered, but by the age of 10, Charlotte was fully deaf. The family moved to the country to give her freedom and fresh air, the family meaning herself, her parents, and her older brother, John. When Charlotte was 16, John was commissioned into the army and was sent off to fight in Portugal. He and Charlotte were close and corresponded constantly. John shared some of her letters with his fellow officers. One of the officers was so taken with the letters that he wanted to meet her. This was George Phelan. Even before Napoleon was defeated and the Peninsular Wars came to an end, many soldiers were sent back to England to be posted to the American wars. When George Phelan arrived back in London in 1813, he and Charlotte met. Before long, they married. His posting was to Nova Scotia. Like many officers' wives at the time, Charlotte accompanied her husband. During their time there, mostly living in barracks, she got to know something of the harsh treatment of the Native Americans, and she was later to write about this. People in Nova Scotia remembered George using sign language to translate the Sunday sermon for Charlotte. They also remembered that George used to beat his wife. George had legal difficulties with regard to his estate in Kilkenny. He got leave to come home and settle his affairs. The couple crossed back across the Atlantic again. The estate was probably near Ballyragget. Charlotte describes it as follows: "Our property consisted of a large quantity of poor cabins with their adjoining land, forming a complete street on the outskirts of the town." George's case was determined in the courts in Dublin. It took the best part of a year to complete. For much of that time, Charlotte was alone, although her mother joined her from England. She transcribed legal documents for George. It was during this time that through her close reading of the Bible, she experienced a conversion from the faith of the Church of England to Evangelicalism. This was a transformative event in her life. She started to write simple penny and twopenny religious books for the Dublin Tract Society. She wrote under the name Charlotte Elizabeth. The society paid her liberally, and Charlotte had found her cause. After his case concluded, George Phelan was again posted to Nova Scotia. This time, Charlotte declined to go with him. She now decided to be independent and to earn a living with her writing. She moved into Kilkenny City in 1820. So what did that Kilkenny look like? Undoubtedly there was poverty. Travellers to the city stressed the fact. But the poverty was acknowledged by local residents too, such as James Switzer, who built an almshouse at the end of the Castle Road, and Joseph Evans, who died in 1818 and left his huge legacy to build an asylum for decayed servants in what is now the Butler Gallery. Almshouses were not the only buildings going up. William Robertson, perhaps Kilkenny's most prolific architect, was busy all over the county. Kilkenny College on John Street, the county council offices of today, it's the Evans one, was now complete. There was a new barracks at Ballybox Street. Part of the old St John's Lantern Church on John Street was being re-roofed as the new parish church. In fact, the 30 years before Charlotte's arrival in 1820 had seen an extraordinary amount of activity in the city. The Dublin Road had been created to replace the steep hill into town at Madeleine Street. It was not until 1848 that there was a railway to Kilkenny. But Kilkenny was opening up to the world. It had its own newspaper, Finn's Leinster Journal. It had good coach connections with Dublin and Cork. Coaches were admittedly expensive and not readily available outside the main roads, hence Humphrey O'Sullivan's description in his diaries of walking from Kilkenny to Callan. In so many ways, Kilkenny appeared to be thriving. Take, for instance, Pickett's Directory of 1822, which lists, among other occupations, 6 hatters, a music seller, 3 dyers, 5 boot and shoemakers, 4 barristers, 7 apothecaries, 3 physicians, 3 ropers, 4 saddlers, 4 soap boilers, 3 stone cutters, 2 straw hat makers, and a paper stainer. Though some decline was noticeable in the woolen industry after the Peninsular War ended in 1815. It was still by far the biggest industry in the city. 11 woolen manufacturers employed 760 people who supported a further 2,500 dependents. A rising Catholic middle class was in evidence. The Catholic Association with Daniel O'Connell at the helm was formed in 1823. In those first 2 decades of the 19th century, a season of plays had been organised by some of the Kilkenny gentry in a purpose-built theatre on the parade. This theatre season helped put Kilkenny on the map. At first the plays were held in private houses, but such was their success they were extended to the public. Proceeds were donated to the poor of the city. These were Charles Kendall Bush, the Languishes and of Knocktopher and the Power family of Kilfane and Thomastown were central to this. Some of their portraits are on the walls of Roath House today, such as Sir John Power, even his brother Richard Power dressed as Hamlet. Other country families, such as the Bryans of Jenkinstown, hosted the players. Thomas Moore, he of the Last Rose of Summer fame, stayed at Jenkinstown. Many of those players opposed the Act of Union. And they had opposed the Act of Union in 1800, and they were critical of the exodus to London of those who had supported it in 1800. These men, these players, believed, like Hubert Butler was to say a century later, that Kilkenny was where their duty lay, and that culture, literature, art and drama were at least some contribution to their native land. In Mansfield Park, Jane Austen describes what were considered the moral dilemmas for genteel women if they acted in dramas. So in Kilkenny it was mostly men who took part. Professional actresses were brought in for some of the women's roles. Elizabeth O'Neill of Drogheda, who was one of those, called the Dove. She was renowned on the London and Dublin stages. Attendees at the plays included Maria Edgeworth and her inventor father Richard Lovell Edgeworth, Henry Grattan and future Prime Minister William Lamb with his wife Lady Caroline. Those in the growing evangelical movement were strong in their criticism of the frivolity of these plays. The evangelical Reverend Peter Rowe of St. Mary's listed 6 bishops who had attended, and lesser clergy too. He said it was, and I quote, "one continued scene of riot and extravagance, the rich and great strengthening each other's hands in wickedness." Peter Rowe was renowned for his sermons and his good work for the poor of the city. He raised funds for the Lees Lane poorhouse. Not only could he fill St. Mary's Church, but he filled churches in Dublin and even England to collecting funds at these sermons for feeding and clothing Kilkenny's poor. The Bible was a bone of contention. Missionary-minded Protestants in towns such as Kilkenny were setting up Bible societies. They believed it important for people to study the scriptures themselves, whereas the Catholic Church at the time felt the Bible needed mediation, that it could not safely be put in the hands of uneducated people without leading to, quote, fanaticism and infidelity in religion, unquote. The Catholic Church provided Dr. Butler's Catechism for their parishioners. In 1824, a debate took place at the Kilkenny courthouse between Protestant and Catholic clergy. A full transcript of this debate, 130 pages, was published just this year. Reverend Hans Hamilton was another evangelical. He lived with his wife in the Vickersfield Rectory at Knocktofer. The Hamiltons ran a domestic school in their house where they trained 13 girls to become servants. In 1821, Charlotte and her mother were invited for a stay. Charlotte gained some first-hand experience at that time of the Rockites. This movement came into being after harvest failures and drought in 1816 and 1821. The process was as follows. Anonymous threatening letters were sent to Protestant landlords such as Hamilton. These letters were followed by intimidation at night by armed gangs. The Rockites at Knocktofer came from Tipperary, and the movement was also strong in Limerick and North Cork. Charlotte's visit there occurred nearly a decade before the Tithe Wars of 1831, when Knocktofer and Hans Hamilton would once again be in the headlines. After her experiences, Charlotte felt strongly about the issues and published a novel about the Rockites. Thomas Moore, the poet, also wrote a novel about Captain Rock, a more romanticised view of the subject. It's important to say that Kilkenny people were ambitious and there was a huge interest in education. In 1824, Kilkenny had 38 schools. These were attended by Catholic and Protestant pupils. With the exception of one, all schools charged a fee. The best known school was Kilkenny College, which had received government funding to build its new John Street premises. Many of the schools were more like Mr. Buchanan's school here at Roath House, well documented by 2 of his pupils, the novelists John and Michael Banham. The most successful school in terms of income was Mrs. Catherine Pack's boarding school for girls on Patrick Street. It was advertised for 12 young ladies, 30 guineas a year each. Their limited number forms a family circle, each to bring a silver spoon, 2 pairs of sheets and 6 napkins. In fact, the school had 24 pupils and had an income of £400 pounds per annum. A more common annual income for the master or mistress of one of these small schools was about £50. One such as Frances Grace, who had a school with 65 pupils in a stone house at Irishtown. But the most remarkable educational establishment in Kilkenny was the Presentation School on James Street, which did not charge any fees. In 1797, 2 Kilkenny women, Isabella McLaughlin of Parliament Street and Catherine Meehan of High Street, entered the Presentation Convent in Cork, founded by Nan O'Nagle. 3 years later, in 1800, the women were back in Kilkenny to establish a primary school on James Street for poor children. They started with 60 pupils, all girls. By 1820 there were 200 pupils, still all girls. By this stage, the Kilkenny school already had daughter houses in Carlow, Galway, Thurles and Wexford within 20 years. Basic reading, writing and arithmetic were taught together with sewing and other skills. In 1821, one of their pupils in James's Street was deaf. Charlotte was not long in Kilkenny before an acquaintance asked her to visit the school to advise the nuns on how to educate a deaf child. Charlotte went and immediately liked the nun she met. This appears to have been Catherine Oldfield, daughter of Edmund Oldfield and Elizabeth Budge of St. Mary's Parish, a mixed marriage, Protestant and Catholic. Charlotte describes her as having all the animated warmth of a genuine Irishwoman. Everything went well and a repeat visit was arranged. Before she left, Charlotte was taken on a tour of the convent, but when they entered a building which turned out to be a chapel, Charlotte encountered a difficulty. I quote, "I found myself in a splendid popish chapel, opposite the altar over which shone a richly gilt cross, while my poor nun was prostrated in the lowliest adoration, touching the ground with her forehead before the senseless idol. I was confounded and unable to say anything, but after a hasty glance the fine trappings left the place, secretly praying for grace and strength to protest openly against the abomination." She goes on to say, "With all my heart I love the gentle, affectionate, elegant nun, and earnestly did I pray for help in bringing her back from the path of destruction." But Charlotte's resolve to save the nun was stopped in its tracks when the nun took exactly the same approach to Charlotte. She urged on Charlotte a strict inquiry into the real doctrines and promised to lend her books. Charlotte agreed to read the books and to comment on them. In reply, she got another book from the nun. So in return, Charlotte sent some more books of her own to the nun. The nun then responded with a note to say she was not allowed to read Charlotte's letters or books, and it was there the matter ended. Charlotte had found her match in Catherine Oldfield. Charlotte's interest in teaching deaf children did not end there. She made the acquaintance of a young 16-year-old boy, Pat Brett maybe, who could both read and write. She taught him finger or sign language so that he could communicate with Jack, his younger dumb brother. Pat too tried to save Charlotte's soul. He told her, "I wouldn't like you to go to hell." He wanted her to learn the Butler Catechism. She in turn wanted him to read the book that God had written, the Bible. When Charlotte eventually returned to England, both Pat and Jack accompanied her with the blessing of their parents. In 1821, the Presentation School was considered so interesting that it was one of the 3 essential places for visitors to see in Kilkenny, the others being Kilkenny Castle and Dunmore Cave. For instance, Sir Walter Scott visited all 3 on his tour of the country, and his choice of must-see places was made on the advice of Marie Edgeworth, the novelist. For locals too, the Presentation had become a place of pride and interest. For example, the convent had to issue tickets for attendance whenever a nun was being professed. Such was the popularity of the event. However, when Charlotte received front row invitations for her mother and herself, after serious soul searching, she felt she had to return the tickets unused. But Charlotte's time in Kilkenny was coming to an end. In 1824, George Phelan returned to Ireland. He made an immediate move to claim his wife's earnings. It was his legal right as a husband. Charlotte, by now, was supporting herself and her mother by her writings, poetry, novels, and religious tracts. The result was that in 1824, Charlotte left for England for the protection of her brother. She describes her departure from Kilkenny. And this was sort of caught me when I read the thing first. I really thought I liked the idea. I'll read the bit to you. "I was now to bid adieu to my pleasant haunts, chief among which was the lordly castle of Kilkenny, where I had passed so very many delightful hours. Its noble owners were abroad, but by their favour I had a key to the private door beside the river, and full access to every part of the castle and its beautiful grounds. It was there I used to muse on days of Ireland's bygone greatness. Gradually I had become as Irish as any of her own children. Initially, Charlotte went to Clifton near Bristol, then to Sandhurst, where her brother John was teaching at the military college. In 1828, John was posted to Ireland. But a short time after he arrived, he tragically drowned in Lough Owel in Westmeath. Charlotte was distraught. After his death, she took responsibility for rearing his young children. I've only dealt here with 2 or 3 of Charlotte's interests, but her later involvements were many. Not only did she become secretary of the Birmingham Anti-Slavery Society, she began writing novels about social problems, such as her book Helen Fleetwood, about the deplorable conditions of the factory system and the exploitation of children there. She wrote about political problems and prison reform too. She even wrote about the siege of Derry. In fact, she became something of an apologist for the Apprentice Boys and the Orange Order. Some of her best songs are still sung by the Order. After her brother's death, Charlotte moved to London and undertook missionary work among Irish immigrants in the East End. For nearly a decade, she edited the Christian Lady magazine and contributed many articles about Ireland to it. In 1837, Charlotte's husband, George Phelan, died. Charlotte immediately took the opportunity to come back to Ireland and travelled around the east and north of the country. Afterwards, she published a book of her impressions entitled Letters from Ireland. In 1841, at the age of 51, Charlotte married fellow evangelical Louis Tonna, 22 years her junior. 3 years after their marriage, Charlotte developed inoperable cancer. She refused opiates and continued working until the end. When her left hand became paralysed, she designed an apparatus to allow her to continue writing. In her last days, her greatest wish was to get to the sea, and her husband, Louis Tonna, brought her to Ramsgate, where she died and was buried in 1846. A short talk can't do justice to the multitude of Charlotte Brown Phelan Tonna's passions and commitments during her brief life. She was an exceptional person, a prolific, hard-working writer, a woman with strong opinions. A reading of the account she gives of her time in Kilkenny in her personal recollections allows us in the 21st century to discover so many things about Kilkenny life in the early 1820s of which we might not otherwise be aware. Thank you.